Welcome to episode 142 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about America's debut, the eponymously titled America. And what I have here is the 1973 reissue of this on Warner's. This is one of those albums where it's actually good not to get a first pressing because the first pressing doesn't actually have their biggest ever hit, A Horse with No Name. Anyway, this one does, subsequent repressings do. I've always wondered where the image on this album cover came from. What it actually is a photograph in the U.S. National Archives called 8 Crow Prisoners at Crow Agency, Montana, 1887. And Ian Samwell, who was a manager of the band, a British guy, was taken with this photograph, and he actually had his office wall wallpapered with it. I've always thought it's kind of weird of the band to have these indigenous people on their album cover, and no one has ever inquired or no one's ever publicized who these people are. Anyway, for a lot of good reasons, it's unlikely that cover would happen today, but that's the origin of that photograph. What to expect from this album? Well, it's America, so their imprint and their sound is really evident from the get-go. It's acoustic folk rock. You have a kind of melancholy feeling to a lot of the songs, but they're very, very beautiful. And of course, being America, the lyrics are almost impenetrable, although there's a little bit of a story behind some of the songs. So America, of course, are Jerry Beckley, Dewey Bunnell, and Dan Peake, and they're all U.S. Air Force brats, all of whom were going to school in the UK in the late 1960s because their dads were all at an Air Force base just outside London. In the late 1960s, when Beckley, Bunnell, and Peake were all teenagers, their families were living at RAF South Ruislip, which is just outside London. I actually only really remember Ruislip as a consequence for falling asleep in the Piccadilly line. But anyway, real things happened in Ruislip, like this band forming. All three could sing and all three could play guitar. Beckley and Peake were also multi-instrumentalists. They could also play the bass, they could play keyboards, and they could each play harmonica. Their original lineup when they were forming up a band in school included a fourth member, a guy called Dave Atwood, who was a drummer. Atwood didn't end up making the permanent lineup. They ended up going without a drummer, but he does play drums on 4 tracks here, and he toured with them in 1972 and 1973. When they finished high school in 1969, the three of them, using borrowed instruments, start to practice more seriously. They're writing songs. They're trying to model themselves basically on Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and particularly on the acoustic sound that trio had, but also on their 3-part harmonies. When it came time to name the band, they settled on America because they were a little bit insecure about their own standing as Americans in Britain, did not want to be mistaken for British musicians if and or when they eventually made it big in the United States, and so this was just an effective piece of branding. They're discovered by a music producer, a guy called Ian Samwell, in whose office this photograph is taken, and by his partner, Jeff Dexter, who would go on to be their manager. They get a big break in terms of exposure and publicity in December 1970, when Dexter gets them on the bill of a big Christmas charity concert headlined by The Who and Elton John. Their reputation continues to grow, and in March 1971, they're signed to a record deal by the UK arm of Warner Brothers Records. Samwell and Dexter want to get America into the studio right after the deal is signed, and so in March 1971, they head into Trident Studios in London. Originally, Beckley, Bunnell, and Peake had wanted to do a concept album like a Sgt. Pepper's. Thankfully, their management team, who were also their production team, Dexter and Samwell, said, that's not a good idea. You guys are really good at high harmonies. You're great with the acoustic stuff. That's really hot right now. Let's really focus on that. And that's what they did. And of course, not only is that their signature sound, they're really amongst the archetypes of that sound from the early 1970s across the whole of music. In the studio, they laid down 11 tracks, and the album was released in December 1971 in Europe only. It does okay, bit of a disappointment, but at the same time, the production team, while the record was being prepared for release, had taken them into a different studio, Morgan Studios, to record some additional tracks, and those included the song that Bunnell had written, which he was calling the Desert Song, which of course is A Horse with No Name. The band and the production team think it's phenomenal, and it gets released as a single ahead of the release of the album itself in the United States. It does phenomenally well. It sells 1 million copies and goes to #1 on Billboard. Seeing as the US version of the album had not yet been released in late 1971, they added A Horse with No Name to the track listing, and the album was released in early 1972, and it goes to #1 in the US. It knocks off Neil Young's Harvest, and it stays at the top of the Billboard charts for 5 weeks. They're now a phenomenon in the United States, where they've never actually played a gig, but by early 1973 at the Grammys, they're being named Best New Act. Dewey Bunnell was probably the strongest songwriter, and he's got 5 of the 6 tracks on side 1. The first of those is Riverside, which kicks off the record, and right away you have that classic America sound, the shimmering sound, 3 acoustic guitars. This lead-off song is also quite indicative of where America would go in terms of songwriting because, like a lot of their songs, it has quite an unconventional song structure. You've got a verse, you've got a chorus and or bridge, and then you have kind of an extended fade. The traditional song structure rarely occurs in this record and does not occur that much in their catalog. One of the charming things about this band is, much like their own circumstances where they're growing up in this kind of weird army world, they seem to just develop without too many outside influences. And the consequence is a lot of uniqueness to their sound and the way they approach songwriting. That's also true of the second song, Sandman, which starts with that ominous strumming and then becomes a slightly more conventional rock song. This song has genuinely military connotations because this, of course, was during the Vietnam War, and Bunnell at the airbase would routinely encounter people who had served in Vietnam, including pilots, and they would tell him stories of being posted in Vietnam, being afraid to go to sleep at night on the base for fear of being attacked, and so you stayed awake because if you were awake, you were going to die. If you slept, you stood a good chance of being killed in a sneak attack. And knowing this, I think you can make a lot more sense of the lyrics, although I don't really get the abandoned hurricane bit. Three Roses has Ray Cooper on bongos again, and a really infectious, syncopated acoustic rhythm being played by Dewey. This song I think you can categorize as a lesser-known gem, and I'm sort of surprised it was not released as a single. The next song, Children, is a little bit less memorable. I think it's an allegory about childhood and war and the loss of innocence, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Anyway, it's not a bad song. It's just not necessarily as hooky or as infectious as some of the other tunes. And speaking of hooky and infectious, now we come to Horse with No Name, their greatest ever hit, and I would say a candidate for one of the most hummable songs of all time. This song is full of great hooks, that opening guitar rhythm, that great little bass turnaround, and of course the harmony kind of sing-along bit, which just, once it's in your head, never leaves. This being America, it's got obscure lyrics about plants and birds and rocks and things. Apparently the song is just a metaphor for getting away from it all. But as usual with America, it's kind of pointless to dwell on the lyrics because for me, their songs are very much kind of like U2 in this way, strangely enough, although they are not very similar bands at all. But what they share with U2 is that their songs are basically soundscapes that they just convey an emotion through the sounds of the guitars, which really paint a picture in your mind. That's followed by a Beckley song called Here, which has a real Crosby, Stills and Nash feel, only with a more insistent beat than they ever actually managed. Dave Atwood is playing drums again. Side 2 starts with the other big hit single of this, I Need You, which is written by Jerry Beckley. Interesting song this. For me, this is the most Beatlesy song. This is quite a Beatles-influenced band, incidentally, and this is the most Beatlesy song on the record. It could easily, if you listen to it, have been a George Harrison song. The next song is Rainy Day, and this is Dan Peek's first contribution to the album. This has amazing guitar work all the way through, including some beautiful slide guitar work by David Lindley. Yes, the David Lindley of El Rayo X fame later in the decade. Here he's doing time as a session guy. Another piece of guitar I love in the song is his beautiful descending acoustic lick, which I think is played in unison by Dan and Jerry, although I can't find verification of that. Never Found the Time is another Dan Peek song. The piano is a little more prominent here than it is anywhere else in the album. Clarice by Beckley is a beautiful song. It's got a spooky intro, and again, a very Crosby, Stills, Nash kind of a feel, particularly the middle eight. The second last song on the album is Donkey Jaw. This is less Crosby, Stills, and Nash as it is Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, because in addition to the harmonies and the acoustic work, you've also got some raggedy-ass electric lead guitar. The theme of the lyrics to this one are very environmental. This is pretty much the straight-up hippie ethos. Quite a contrast with the last song on the album, which is a song by Dewey Bunnell, or more of a songlet. It's only about a minute in length, called Pigeon Song. This is a solo piece by Dewey, and it has what you can only really describe as a horrific lyric in which a guy kills his pets and blows up a bridge and ruins or destroys a farm so he can be free. Anyway, it's not particularly compelling, and it's actually really kind of a jarring thing to have at the end of an otherwise very beautiful album. Overall, this is a very strong album. Setting aside the last song, there are no weak tracks in the record. There are two real standout tracks. The only thing that separates them from all the rest of them is not so much the quality of the playing or the composition, it's just maybe the lack of hooks. But above and beyond the individual songs, you can see why these guys wanted to make a concept album, because what they deliver here is a concept. The whole feeling of this album is, on the one hand, airy and light, but there's also some melancholy, like I said at the outset, and some sadness. And the two of those things in combination just make this very beautiful and very rewarding to listen to repeated times. It's not perfect. It lacks a little variety. There's a little bit of inexperience in the way the songs are produced. The Pigeon Song is not a great song, but overall it's a great record, one of the best folk rock albums of the 1970s, and I give it a 4 out of 5.